Hello and welcome once again to Lard Island, home of Two Fat Lardies Wargames Rules. Further to our last video where we looked at selecting a force for sharp practice, today we have our first chance to look at some of the rule mechanisms proper. With any game there is going to be much that's familiar, but also some ideas which we hope will be new and interesting. Here we're going to have a look at, very quickly, how to select a scenario and then go into more detail about how a game begins with deployment onto the table. Sharp practice is first and foremost a skirmish game, so when designing the 6 core scenarios we kept that very much in mind. The rules provide 6 scenarios, 3 of which are titled battles and 3 missions. This has been done to provide a real variety of game types. Scenario 1 is a classic encounter battle between 2 forces. Scenario 2 is a mission with one side tasked with sweeping the table to find supplies or to root out a hidden spy. Scenario 3 is a battle with one side defending in depth, whereas Scenario 4 is an escort mission. Like all great narrative games, the scenarios are designed to allow you to embellish them as much as you like. Escorting a beautiful Confederate spy will usually be rather more rewarding as a game than escorting a wagon of potatoes, but you can choose the level of narrative you want to add to your game. Scenario 5 is a battle with an attack on an objective, and finally Scenario 6 is a rescue mission. Each scenario has different deployment areas, each has a varying number of minor characters which you can add to the game to provide colour, and on top of these there are 3 mini campaign plots provided which overlay on top of the scenarios and allow you to play the set scenarios as though they're a narrative campaign. Of course, we plan to produce a wide range of pint-sized campaigns which will cover a huge choice in periods and will really expand greatly what's already in the main rules, with additional periods being covered, additional force options and some additional support options depending on what the setting is. Okay, so as you can see, picking a scenario is easy. Just a simple matter of rolling a dice or choosing one you want from the rules. Of course, you can always go a bit more freestyle and make up your own or base it on a historical action, but at least you've got those 6 core scenarios there in the rules that are going to get you started playing. What I want to look at now is how we set up for our scenarios and what the implications are for how our troops will then deploy onto the table. Sharp practice uses a system of deployment points to show the general area where troops can deploy onto the table during the game. The primary deployment point represents not only where troops can arrive, but also their line of communications with friendly forces. As such, you really need to make sure that you protect that or your force morale is likely to suffer. But let's have a look how deployment points work. Here we're going to take a look at our sand table in the Lard Island Officers' Mess. This has been set up in a simple manner so as to allow us to show off exactly how deployment works. What we've done is we've created a system which allows both sides to deploy their forces in a way which gets us straight into the game and avoids a lengthy deployment phase at opposite ends of the table. Now, there are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, it encourages players to make bold deployments which get the game moving rapidly and ensures that the action starts almost from the first moment. And secondly, it replicates the commitment the commander makes when he deploys his troops onto the battlefield in real life. Let's have a look at that table now. Here we see our sand table. It's a pretty typical Wargames table with a couple of farms, hills and a smattering of woods. We've kept it really simple so we can focus on the deployment options for both sides. First we see blue places primary deployment point. This is an attack and defend scenario with blue's objective being to hold the farm on the western half of the table. That's where he's placing his primary deployment point. Now we see red's primary deployment point on the road to the east. Blue knows that this is the general direction from which red will come. Troops are deployed onto the table when their leader is activated. At that point, the player can decide whether to deploy or whether to wait until a later turn. In some situations, there are advantages in deploying immediately. In others, it can be better to keep your powder dry and keep some of your troops hidden. The deployment points are not precisely where the troops deploy, but they do determine the general area into which they can be placed. How far that is from the deployment point depends on the type of troops, on their orders, on whether they can be seen. Let's take a standard line infantry troops for an example. Standard line troops can deploy up to 6 inches from the deployment point. We can see that here shown on this image. However, if they're the defenders in a scenario, they can extend that by an additional 6 inches up to 12 inches. If they're out of line of sight of the enemy deployment point or any enemy troops on the table, that extends a further 6 inches to 18 inches. We can see here that allows our defenders a pretty wide area to deploy into, although here it's limited by Red's line of sight as shown by the arrows. Now, we mentioned that different troop types have different ranges of deployment. Here we can see light infantry and impact cavalry who have a basic distance of 9 inches. Again, that extends by a further 6 inches if they're defending and another 6 inches if they're out of line of sight of Red. Skirmish troops, mass troops like tribal forces and dragoons can deploy a basic 12 inches away from the deployment point. Again, this is as extended as we've seen, with 6 inches additional to that if they are the defenders in the scenario, and a further 6 inches if they're out of line of sight of the enemy. Scouting and irregular cavalry can deploy the furthest away with a basic distance of 18 inches. If they're defending, as they are here, that goes up to an impressive 24 inches. So, as we can see, Blue has a lot of deployment options from just one deployment point. It's likely that his more mobile, lighter troops will be deployed forward, but he still has a lot of choice on that. He can hold troops back, he can keep his force in one central position or deploy them across a wider area. But what about Red? As we saw, Red has one deployment point on the road. Well, this is more restricting. But in this case, the player has selected a scout as a support option, so this allows him to use a secondary deployment point to represent the scout guiding the force onto the table in an advantageous way. The secondary deployment point must be placed within 24 inches of the primary deployment point and at least 30 inches from Blue's primary deployment point. So let's have a look at the options Red has. We can see some of Red's options here. All three have got something to offer. The central position hopefully allows a quick capture of the eastern farm. The northern option would allow a flanking movement in that area. And the southern option would allow a similar movement to the south. So, Red's got some choices to make, but all of them look pretty attractive. So, there we can see some of the support options and permutations which make selecting of the right supports and the placement of the deployment points so interesting as part of the game. The question for Red is whether to spend points on additional deployment points or simply to take more troops but have to deploy them from a tighter area whilst potentially at risk from a counterattack from a more nimble Blue force. Well, hopefully that sheds some light into the way the game starts at the outset. In our next edition, we're going to be looking at taking that further and command and control and how the game then evolves and the use of leaders on the tabletop. I hope you'll be able to join me then.